state some caveats up front. One, I'm a little under the weather, and I've got this, this whole thing of lozenges. So if I cough, I apologize, but I'm going to try not to. Two, James surprised me by telling me that I was the first speaker, which I found out yesterday, or the day before yesterday.
I gave you 2 days.
Yeah, he gave me 2 days. That's true. And then I spent all of yesterday and all of this morning finishing my slides and working on them. So hopefully this works. We'll see. So I have no particular expertise in this area. This is mostly speculation and conjecture from personal experience, right? So we'll see what happens. This talk is primarily about intermediation and disintermediation, which is a particular topic that I'm interested in. So a little background about me that might help you understand why. My name is Aneel. Hi. I work in tech. I've been in tech for going on 22 years now, actually, which is a very long time. I look younger than I am. Good genes. I thank my mother for that. So here are just some facts about me that might be interesting. I grew up poor. I'm the son of an immigrant. I'm an only child. I'm fairly bad at empathy, which is a thing. If you've been to Monktoberfest, you've heard and know for a fact. Also, I've been all over tech. I've done a lot of operations work, software engineering, product work, marketing. I've been at very large companies and I've been at very small companies. And consistently, the kind of work I seem to be drawn to and the things that I'm interested in building or working on tend to be those things that put new power into hands of people who did not have it before in some small way. I mean, it's the kind of work I do it's very small, in a very small way for a very small particular group of people, but nevertheless, it wouldn't be fun otherwise. So I want to start with very basic concepts. How do we as people build things? At this point in our history, and probably every point in our history except for whoever the first people were, no one builds in isolation, right? You build on what has come before. We build things on things that other people built. You don't think, oh, hey, I'd like to start a company, let me find a river and build a really big wheel, and it's going to turn because of the kinetic energy of the water, which I'm going to somehow store as electricity or maybe power a light, and by that light, I'm going to write down the ideas by which I will then go and form a company. That is not how anything works. So everything we utilize and consume in the end is a result of layers and layers and layers of built things. Every app on this device relies on centuries, literally centuries and generations of advances and technologies that came before. Buildings, electricity, computers, telecommunications, internet, mobile devices, wireless technology, wireless data, even smartphones. Everything we buy in grocery stores, it's the same as true. Farming, domestication, automation, packaging, shipping, distribution, futures trading, insurance, advertising, all of that goes into getting something that is raw from the ground to your hands. That's just the nature of how we do things. But another way to look at it, or something that might look very similar, is that layers and layers and layers are also the continual introduction of new intermediaries between yourself and the original source of the thing that you want, or the thing that you're consuming, or the thing that that you're utilizing. Intermediaries sit between us and information or facts. Layers of media, third parties that reframe and condition that information for our consumption. Each of those intermediaries takes a cut. They take a cut of marginal profit, of course, from a commercial perspective, but they also take a cut of influence, and they take a cut of power. And power accrues to these intermediaries as more of them get introduced. Intermediaries that sit between us and our governance, layers of lobbyists, various kinds of influencers, politicians, they transmogrify legitimate needs of a populace or a citizenry, and they turn them into laws and regulations and other forms of governance. But each of those intermediaries also takes a cut of actual marginal profit, because everyone makes money in these transactions, real influence and power at core. There are intermediaries that sit between us and our food sources. Of course, this is the most obvious one and the thing that's talked about most when people consider sustainability and so on. There are layers of distributors, sourcers, packagers, industrializers, shipping and logistics providers, all these parties that turn real food sometimes into, tasteless calorie filler. But nevertheless, by doing so, each of them takes a cut of marginal profit, of influence, and of power. For all of these things, they're really all supply chains, right, or value chains, if you think of them in the most abstract sense. We as consumers, we make a ton of assumptions based on some implicit set of ideas about how things should work, right? So we've got this concept of a social contract, basically, that's implicit in our brains and implicit in any social setting. And these social contracts differ quite a bit, culture to culture or region to region, but nevertheless, they're there. We believe, we expect, and we rely on those assumptions being upheld to some degree, right? So here's an example of one. My food is made of food, actual food. There's food in my food. At least what I would recognize as food, right? Things coming from actual plants and animals in some recognizable form that every human would look at and go, yeah, that constitutes a food stuff. My nation, my city, my state, whatever. It has laws and regulations. Those laws and regulations were made to protect me from harm and in some way to maximize my welfare as a citizen. Now, that could be down to me, the individual, or to my family, or to my class, or my subgroup, or whatever, but essentially this is a belief that people hold. It's part of their social contract that's in their brain, that's implicit about how we think about the things that are provided to us. We also assume that our information is generally reliable, although I guess that's not a thing we assume anymore. And that opinions, analysis, and speculation are to some degree separated from our information. Not that there has never been information warfare, there's always been information warfare. But that it's distinguishable, right? That to some degree, in general, you can distinguish the facts of the matter from manipulation of the facts of the matter. This is peanut butter. Is peanut butter a thing in the UK? I don't actually know. Yeah? Sweet. All right. So this peanut butter. One would think that the following statement is uncontroversial. Peanut butter is made of peanuts. Seems like an expectation, right? That's a natural assumption of every buyer of peanut butter, wherever peanut butter is bought. That's an implicit social contract, right? It's trust. It's trust that you place in this supply chain behind what you consume. That goes all the way back to the peanut farmer at the bottom and the grocer at the top, or wherever you go to acquire your peanut butter. So here's a peanut butter brand. 90% of this is peanuts. The rest is stuff, additives, some natural, some that are byproducts of peanuts. So legitimate, you could be like, oh, maybe 95% is peanuts. Some very much less so. When this product first came to market, I think in the 70s or the 60s, it was 75% peanuts. 20% of it was vegetable shortening. It was Crisco. People were eating a significant chunk of Crisco when they ate this. No one knew that, right? That was in tiny, tiny letters with many, many words, and no one knew that that was what it was. That's not true anymore because regulations say it has to be 90% now. But I still don't know what the other 10% is. So the world behind where we interact with something, that whole supply chain and value chain, in this case, a grocery store shelf, can and does change, right? Our social contracts and the trust we have about what goes into a thing that we consume or utilize are regularly breached and invalidated without our knowing and without our noticing. We're so far removed from sources, with so many intermediaries between us and sources, that we have neither knowledge nor power. This is the very definition of being disempowered and disenfranchised. You have no vote over this. You cannot have a vote over this. The whole system is designed to prevent you from having a vote over this. So though we are at the very end of the supply chain from one perspective, from another, if you consider this idea that you don't really have a vote, then you're not at that point a consumer to whom a thing is given or sold or traded. You are a product. You're a product that's sold through marketing and advertising to middlemen, to one of the middlemen, right? Marketing and advertising sells us to one of the middlemen, and we are effectively being industrially farmed for our money, for capital, right? So we're being industrially farmed for capital. On the other end, there's some industrialized process to create a good, and somewhere in the middle is the real consumer. In the middle is the person that's consuming the raw materials and turning them into something, and consuming your capital and swapping them and enriching itself, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because in the case where the stuff is good and your work is honest and everyone's trading equally and fairly, this is a beautiful thing. This is how civilization scales. However, wherever there is civilization scaling, there are grifters and middlemen and intermediary taking a cut by screwing us all on both ends of the spectrum. So what does it mean to sustain? I know it's a long time for me to get around to my points. So sustaining means to maintain, preserve, conserve, perpetuate, bear without breaking or failing. When people talk about sustainability in craft, what are the actual things they're talking about? It's usually things at the beginning of the supply chains. It's the source materials, the source things, the source activities. From our positions at the end, at the other end of that chain, we're effectively powerless. Our options seem to be pursue lawsuits, create PR disasters, or spend differently. These are the things we've seen people do in the world, some of which are possible only to the lucky, influential, or wealthy. Sometimes this might be relying on third parties that assert that something is fair trade, organic, what have you, actually introducing a new middleman. Sometimes it's choosing to not be at the beginning of a particular supply chain, right? And instead selling directly to your consumer, so skipping all the middlemen. Sometimes it's choosing to become a source yourself, to craft, to build things. Craft fairs and farmers markets are typical examples. They cut out most intermediaries. Direct-to-consumer online marketplaces and businesses take that same process and try to bring it online. These are all attempts at removing layers, right? At closing the distance between we, the consumer, and we, the source. This enables us to, as directly as possible, validate the trust that we have in our social contracts. And to say that, yes, my social contract that I believe exists is being upheld, and the only way I can believe it is by removing all the people between me and verifying that belief. So, from my perspective, the very act of removing these layers and going through this disintermediation process is the populace that's doing it reacting to having lost power, right? We are seeking empowerment. We are seeking enfranchisement. Oftentimes, craft and sustainability are confused with stasis and maintaining some arbitrary original way of doing something. And this is my final note. I'm making up for the fact that we started late because I went fast. So, and this is a very interesting way of viewing things. The very act of innovating is what allows us to sustain some source material or some tradition, right? The fact that we do direct-to-consumer sales, the fact that we have craft fairs and farmers markets, the fact that, that we can maintain a way of doing things while building new innovative things. That is one of the core sources of how to achieve empowerment, enfranchisement, and sustainability. Thank you.